The assembly rooms at Thornport were lit with 40 candles on the night Maren Ashby heard the thing that would save her children's lives, and not a soul in that room knew she could hear a word of it. She stood near the south wall, where the wallpaper had begun to peel at its seam, and the candles gave less light than the rest, and she held her reticule against her hip with both hands, so that the small tin music box inside it would not knock against the whalebone of her stays. The box was her daughter Nora's, technically a gift from Maren's own mother that had survived the journey from her girlhood home to Gerald Ashby's house, and then to this rented room in Thornport, and then into the pocket of a widow's gown on a Tuesday evening in April of 1814. It played 4 bars of a lullaby if you wound the key on its underside. Nora wound it every night before she slept. Maren had slipped it into her reticule without thinking, the way a woman carries a piece of another person with her when she is afraid. Jeffrey Ashby stood 12 feet away, talking to a solicitor whose name Maren had never been given, and he was not bothering to lower his voice. He had not bothered to lower his voice for 6 years. None of them had. That was the point. "The petition is ready," Jeffrey said, his wine glass tilted slightly in his hand, as if the conversation were of no more consequence than a remark on the weather. "Harwick says the magistrate will hear it before the summer sessions. The widow cannot contest it. She cannot understand it." The solicitor, Harwick, glanced toward Maren. She did not meet his eyes. She turned her gaze to the musicians tuning at the far end of the room. Her expression arranged into the mild and courteous vacancy she had worn in public since the winter of 1808, when she had first understood what Jeffrey intended to do with the silence she had never chosen. "She cannot even appeal," Jeffrey added, "not without a legal guardian's countersignature, and she has none." The music box pressed its small hard edge against her palm through the silk of the reticule. Nora and Thomas were at the house in Crane Street with Agnes keeping watch, and the petition Jeffrey had just described would remove them from Maren's care before midsummer, unless something changed. She had known about the petition for 11 days. She had known about Jeffrey's plan for 4 years before that. She had known, on the night she decided to stop speaking in the presence of the Ashby household, that the knowing was the only thing she had left to protect them with. Pay attention to what a woman does with an impossible constraint. You might be surprised by what she builds from it. The doors at the north end of the assembly room opened, and Edmund Vane, the Earl of Dorset, walked in from the cold with rain still on his coat. She had not expected him. She did not think anyone in Thornport had. He was known as the man who had not visited his secondary estate at Thornport in 4 years, whose steward managed everything by letter, whose name appeared in the parish register and the land records, but never in the assembly rooms. He was lean in the way that grief makes a person lean, as though the body has quietly surrendered its surplus. His hair was dark and cut too close to the ear. He stood at the edge of the room and looked at nothing in particular, with the particular intensity of a man who has trained himself not to want anything inside a room. Then his gaze found her. Maren did not move. She had spent 6 years not moving when she was noticed. He looked away after precisely 3 seconds. She counted them, the way she counted everything now. The doors closed behind him, and Jeffrey lowered his voice for the first time all evening, and said to Harwick, "The deaf widow. She does not know what year it is." Maren did not turn her head. She watched the musicians. One of them was tuning a viola badly, the peg slipping so that the note slid flat and caught itself and slid flat again. And she focused on that small, suffering sound and breathed through her nose and decided what she was going to do next. She had been deciding what to do next for 6 years. The deciding had kept her children in the same house as her body, and it was the only thing that had. The pretense had begun on a Tuesday evening in November of 1808, which was 6 months after Gerald died. And 3 months after she had first found the letter, Jeffrey had written to Harwick. Gerald had not been a cruel man. He had been an incurious one, the kind of man who signed papers his brother placed before him without asking why the papers existed, who believed that Gerald's wishes and the family's wishes were identical, because the idea that they might diverge had never been presented to him in a form he could receive. The letter described Maren as unsuitable for the children's continued care. It cited 3 incidents of conduct that had not occurred. It proposed a remedy, a petition of incapacity, filed in the event the widow showed signs of instability or made claims that could not be substantiated, such as claims about the family's financial arrangements. She had been about to make exactly those claims. She had been preparing to go to the family solicitor for 3 weeks when the letter arrived in a packet of papers Gerald's man of business had sent to the wrong address by error and which the carrier had redirected to Marin's own desk. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, with her hand pressed flat against the desktop to keep it from shaking. Then she went to dinner, sat across from Jeffrey and his wife Cordelia, and did not hear a word either of them said. She had not heard them since. 6 years of not hearing had taught her more than 6 years of careful listening might have done, because people who believe a woman cannot hear them speak the architecture of their plans aloud without noticing the walls. She knew the amount Jeffrey had borrowed against the Ashby estate in Gerald's name, £9,000, secured against the children's inheritance in a deed Gerald had signed the month before his fever took him. She knew Cordelia had redirected the quarterly income from the Dorset tenancy, money that by the terms of Gerald's will belonged to the Children's Trust, into a separate account she held in her own maiden name. She knew that Harwick had drafted the petition twice and torn it up twice, because he was not entirely comfortable with its contents, and she knew this because she had been standing in a hallway in Harwick's offices in February of the previous year, when he said so to a clerk, his voice carrying clearly through a door that he did not trouble to close because the deaf widow was in the anteroom. And what did it matter? What she did not know was how to stop the petition before the summer sessions, without revealing that she had heard every word of it being assembled. The spring assembly at Thornport was not where she had expected an answer. She had come because Jeffrey had required her attendance, because a deaf widow who did not appear in public at her brother-in-law's side was a deaf widow who might be agitating privately, and Jeffrey was alert to the possibility of agitation. She wore her second-best gown, which was gray and competent, and said nothing about her. Her hair was dressed by Agnes, who was the only person in the household who knew the truth, and who had known since the first year, when Marin had come into the kitchen at midnight and found Agnes waiting with a candle and a face that asked no questions. The tin music box sat in her reticule. She turned slightly toward the room as the assembly filled. He had not sat down. He stood near the north wall, which was the wall opposite Marin's south wall, and he was watching Jeffrey with the quality of attention that a man gives to a figure he is trying to understand. Not hostility. Assessment. The kind of looking that precedes a decision. He had been one of Gerald's acquaintances in a distant, landowner-to-landowner way, she understood. She had never met him before Gerald's death. She had not expected to meet him tonight. She had not expected him to cross the room. He crossed the room in 11 measured strides and stopped at a distance of 3 feet from her left side, and said, in a voice pitched low enough that Jeffrey could not hear it, "The fire is at the east end. You will be warmer there." She did not look at him. She turned her gaze forward and did not respond. He did not repeat himself. He moved slightly to his left, so that he stood between her and the south wall's draft, and said nothing further. He simply stood there, blocking the cold. A command to shelter when she had not asked to be sheltered. Her pulse registered this. Mine did not permit her to address what her pulse registered. The music began at 8:30. Jeffrey moved to the card room. Edmund remained at the east end of the room by the fire, and twice during the evening Marin saw him watching Jeffrey with that same quality of precise assessment. He did not dance. He did not approach her again. When the clock showed 11, he retrieved his coat from a footman and was gone, before Cordelia had finished her card hand. Marin walked home through the damp April evening with Jeffrey's voice in her ears. Before the summer sessions. The magistrate will hear it. She cannot contest it. She wound the music box for Nora that night, sitting on the edge of the child's bed in the room the 2 children shared on the upper floor of the Crane Street house, and Nora turned over in her sleep toward the sound without waking, and Thomas had his fist pressed against his cheek the way he had slept since he was 2 years old and Gerald was still alive. Marin sat between their beds for a long time after the music stopped. 2 days after the assembly, Edmund appeared at the Crane Street house. He came to speak to Jeffrey, he said at the door, on the matter of a shared drainage easement that the Dorset and Ashby holdings had disputed since the previous autumn. Agnes showed him to the parlor. Jeffrey was not in. He was at Harwick's offices, which Marin knew because she had heard him tell Cordelia so at breakfast. Marin was in the parlor when Edmund entered it, sitting at the small writing table near the window with a letter she was composing to her own solicitor, a man in London named Fell, who had represented her family before her marriage, and who had been trying to reach her for 7 months. She did not look up when Edmund came in. She heard Agnes say something at the door about the mistress being present if Mr. Ashby's guest would like to wait. Edmund said, "I will wait." He sat in the chair nearest the window. He did not look at her. He withdrew a small notebook from his coat pocket and made notes in it, unhurried, for the period of time it took Maren to finish her letter and sand it and fold it. She was aware of him the way she was aware of all sounds she was not supposed to register, with the whole surface of her attention held carefully inward, nothing allowed to show in her hands or her posture or the angle of her head. The scratching of his pen was deliberate, the turn of a page, a pause during which she could hear his breathing slow into the rhythm of a man who is accustomed to sitting in rooms with difficult problems and waiting for the correct moment to address them. Then he looked up, directly at her, and said at a speaking volume, "He is not coming back this morning." She did not respond. He did not lower his gaze. He said, "The drainage dispute was settled in December. I did not come about the easement." The letter was folded in her lap. She held it there. Her hands were very still. She had learned to keep her hands still as a point of discipline in the first months of the pretense, because her hands had always been the part of her that thought aloud, quick and expressive, and Geoffrey watched her hands in those early months, looking for evidence of comprehension that her face was not providing. "You were at the assembly Tuesday evening," Edmund said. "I have been told you are unwell." Cordelia Ashby used that word. "She said it to my housekeeper, who told my steward, who told me, because my steward understands that I am interested in what is said about the people on land adjacent to my estate." Unwell was the new word Geoffrey had found for her in the months since Harwick's most recent draft of the petition. She was no longer the deaf widow, not in the more genteel circles of Thornport. She was unwell. She had been unwell for years. Was it not a sadness? She counted the stitches in the cuff of her sleeve. 14. She had counted them before, in other rooms, during other conversations she was not supposed to hear. It was the thing she did with her eyes when she needed her face to stay empty. Edmund closed his notebook. He replaced it in his coat pocket. He stood and crossed to the door and said, before he left, "I will come again when he is in." She did not watch him go. She heard the front door close and then the sound of his boots on the stone step outside. 2 sharp, clean sounds on the wet stone. And then the street received him and she breathed once, carefully, and put the letter to Fell in the inside pocket of her day dress, where Geoffrey never thought to look. The witnessing came 12 days later, in the garden behind the Crane Street house, where Thomas had been told to stay inside and had not stayed inside, and Geoffrey had found him in the lane at the side of the property and taken him by the collar of his coat with the particular grip of a man who is demonstrating authority rather than providing safety. Thomas was 6 years old. He did not make a sound when Geoffrey gripped him. He had learned the shape of Geoffrey's moods before he learned his letters. Maren came around the corner of the garden wall at the moment Geoffrey said, "You were told to stay in. You will do as you are told in this house." She was at Geoffrey's side in 3 steps. She did not speak. She took Thomas's arm at the elbow and stepped between them, placing her body between Geoffrey and the child, and looked at Geoffrey with the expression she had worn for 6 years. The one that said she had not heard and could not understand, and was only a deaf widow standing in a garden. Nothing more. Geoffrey released Thomas's collar. He looked at her for a long moment, his jaw set, and then he straightened his own coat and went back into the house. She held Thomas's arm until Geoffrey was inside. Edmund had been standing at the gate in the garden wall. She did not know how long he had been there. She looked up and found him, and his face held an expression she had not seen on him before, and could not name precisely, except that it was not assessment, and it was not the quality of watching he had worn at the assembly. It was something she did not have a word for. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. He did not speak. He turned and walked back toward his horse, which was tied to the post at the corner of the lane, and he rode away without looking back. Thomas pressed his forehead against her side. She put her hand against the back of his head and stood in the garden for a moment, before she could make her legs take them both inside. If you have ever watched a woman refuse to be small in the only way available to her, you understand what Maren Ashby did in that garden, and you understand why he rode back to his estate and sat in his study for the better part of an afternoon before he could return to anything he had been doing before he saw it. The wound was something she had not expected to discover, and she had not been meant to. It was Agnes who brought it into the open, indirectly and without knowing she did. Agnes had served in the Vane household at the Thornport estate before Gerald hired her away 12 years ago, and she still had friends in the kitchen at Dorset House, as the locals called Edmund's secondary property, and those friends passed information the way all household staff pass information. In the brief windows between duties and across back fences, Agnes mentioned to Maren, in the quiet way, Agnes mentioned things she thought Maren needed to know, that the Earl had returned to Dorset House properly for the first time in 4 years, that he had opened the rooms on the east wing that had been shut since his wife's death, that he had sent for a painter to do something about the portrait in the upper hall, which had been turned to face the wall since the spring of 1810. Maren had not asked what happened in the spring of 1810. She found out on a Wednesday evening in May, when she went to Dorset House at Agnes's suggestion to retrieve a pattern book. Agnes had lent to the cook there, and she arrived at the kitchen door at the same moment Edmund was crossing the kitchen yard from the stables, and he stopped when he saw her and said, "Go in, it is cold," which was another command that was not a command, and she went in without looking at him and stood near the kitchen hearth, while Agnes's friend the cook found the pattern book, and Edmund came in behind her and stood near the door. He said something to the cook. Maren could not tell to whom he was speaking without turning, which would have been too obvious a tell, and she kept her eyes on the shelf of copper pots across from her. Then she heard him say, with the lowered voice he used when he did not think anyone but the person he was addressing could hear, "Margaret was in her 8th month. I was in Exeter settling the land dispute my father had left behind, because I believed there was time. There was not time. By the time I arrived, she was already gone, and so was the child. I had 3 letters from the midwife in my coat pocket that I had not opened." The cook said something soft and indistinct. Edmund said, "I have not been able to stay in this house for 4 years. I am attempting to stay now." Maren looked at the copper pots. Her hand rested on the edge of the kitchen table. The pattern book arrived at her elbow, and she took it and nodded her thanks, and walked home through the evening with the book under her arm and Edmund's voice carried inside her the way the music box was carried, smalls and weighty, and playing the same 4 bars. He had been absent when it mattered most. He had believed there was time, and there had not been time, and he had punished himself with 4 years of distance from the house where it happened. She understood the punishment. She had watched herself perform a version of it for 6 years, present in body but absent in some legible way that kept the most dangerous people from understanding what she was. The petition arrived on the 1st of June. Harwick delivered it himself, which she had not expected. He came to the Crane Street house on a Friday morning when Geoffrey was home, and he sat across from Geoffrey in the parlor with the document in his hands, and Geoffrey called Maren in. She came and sat in the chair nearest the door and folded her hands in her lap and listened. Harwick read the petition aloud. It described her as mentally disordered, incapable of managing her affairs or the children's welfare, and petitioned the magistrate to grant temporary guardianship of Nora and Thomas Ashby to their paternal uncle Geoffrey, pending a full hearing. Cordelia was there. She sat near the window in a blue morning dress, and she said to Harwick, when he had finished reading, "The deaf widow will not understand the proceedings, of course. That is rather the point." That was the 3rd time. Maren looked at the fireplace. The grate held last night's ash. She had let the fire go low because June had come in warm, and she sat looking at the gray ash and thought very carefully about the next 6 hours. Geoffrey said, "We will present it to the magistrate on Monday. She will need to be present for form's sake. Can she be made to appear voluntarily, or will we need to arrange it otherwise?" Harwick said quietly, "I would prefer voluntarily." Geoffrey said, "It will be voluntary then. She goes where I tell her." He was right. She had gone where he told her for 6 years. She had been the deaf widow, and then the unwell widow, and then the widow who was shortly to lose her children, and she had gone everywhere he arranged for her to go. When they finished, Geoffrey and Cordelia left the parlor together, and Harwick gathered his papers with the particular deliberateness of a man who is not comfortable with the room he has been in, and Maren sat very still in the chair near the door until she heard all 3 sets of footsteps disperse and a door close somewhere on the upper floor. Then she rose and went to the kitchen. Agnes was at the table, cutting the ends from a bundle of asparagus. She looked up at Maren and did not ask a question, which was the manner Agnes had perfected across 6 years. Maren stood at the kitchen table and looked at the asparagus for a moment. The pale green ends fell away from the knife in small, orderly pieces. She picked up one of them and turned it in her fingers. She said, in the low voice she used only in the kitchen, only with Agnes, only when the house was arranged so that no one could come upon them unheard, Monday. Agnes said, "I know." Maren set the asparagus end down on the table. She had one decision to make, and she had already made it on the walk from the parlor to the kitchen, which was why her hands were steadier than they had been in the parlor. The only question that remained was whether Edmund was the man she believed him to be, which was a question she had been gathering evidence on for 2 months, and which she had now answered to her own satisfaction. She had watched him in the assembly rooms. She had heard him in the kitchen at Dorset House. She had watched him stand between her and the draft in April without asking anything in return. The evidence was not large in any single piece. Taken altogether, it was sufficient. "I need paper," she said to Agnes. Agnes rose and found it. She sent it through Agnes, who delivered it in person to Edmund's steward, who brought it to Edmund within the hour. The message was brief. She wrote that she had been able to hear for the entirety of the 6 years he had known her in this county, that she was not unwell, that she was in danger, and so were her children, and that she believed he had been watching Geoffrey long enough to know why. She waited for a response until midnight. None came. She wound the music box for the children and sat between their beds and counted what she had. She had the letter to Fell in London, dispatched 6 weeks ago, in which she had described the £9,000 debt and the redirected trust income, and the document she had copied in Harwick's offices in February of the previous year, a copy she had made sitting at the anteroom writing table, while the clerk brought her water, because she had asked for water with her hands because she could not speak. And the clerk had been gone for 3 minutes, and 3 minutes had been enough. She had kept the copy in the inside pocket of 3 successive day dresses for 4 months, and then sent it to Fell folded inside a request for legal consultation on a routine matter of her father's estate, because routine matters were the kind of thing that arrived unsealed on a widow's desk. Fell had written back twice. The second letter had said that the matter was not routine and that he would be traveling to Thornport. She did not know if he had arrived. She did not know what Edmund intended to do with her message. She wound the music box to the end of its key and set it on the table between the children's beds and lay down on her own bed with her shoes still on. She was still awake when the clock in the hall struck 3. The assembly at Thornport in June was not as grand as the April assembly had been, because June was the fraying end of the season, and the great families were beginning their remove to their summer estates. There were 40 people in the room when Maren arrived on Geoffrey's arm, and Cordelia arrived on Geoffrey's other arm, and Harwick was somewhere toward the back, and Edmund was standing near the north wall, exactly as he had stood in April. He had not responded to her message, or he had responded in the way he had responded to everything, which was with his body rather than with words, because he was standing near the north wall, and not at his estate, and not in Exeter, and he was watching Geoffrey with a quality of attention that was no longer assessment. A man of perhaps 60, small and precise in a dark coat, stood beside Edmund. Maren did not recognize him. The evening pressed forward the way evenings press forward when a person is waiting for something to happen that may not happen in time. The musicians played a country dance. Geoffrey accepted a glass of claret from a passing footman. Cordelia moved from conversation to conversation, in the easy, unhurried way of a woman who has nothing to fear from the evening, and Maren stood in her gray gown near the south wall, and watched her and felt the music box in her reticule and counted the minutes between 8:00 and midnight, and divided them into the number of things that could go wrong. She had told Edmund everything in the message: the £9,000, the redirected trust income, the copied document she had sent to Fell, the fact of the hearing on Monday. She had written it without flourish in her plainest hand on a single sheet, because there had been no time for anything other than the plainest statement. She did not know if it had been enough. She did not know if Edmund was a man who could be moved by a plain statement, or if he was the kind of man who needed the evidence arranged for him in a particular way. She counted what she had that evening: her body in a gray gown, the music box against her hip, Agnes at her elbow, the knowledge, which was no small thing, that she had been right about everything for 6 years, and that no one had known it. She recognized Fell 12 minutes later when Agnes, who had been permitted to attend as Maren's companion, because Geoffrey had decided This was a useful demonstration of his sister-in-law's manageable quality. Leaned close to Marin's ear and said, very quietly, "The man beside Lord Vane is a Mr. Fell of London." Marin did not look toward them. She looked at the musicians. One of them was tuning a viola, and the note slid flat and caught and slid flat, and she breathed through her nose and was very still. Geoffrey moved toward Harwick. Cordelia moved toward a friend near the eastern wall. Marin had perhaps 90 seconds in which she was unobserved. Edmund crossed the room in 11 strides, which was the same number of strides it had taken him in April, and he stopped at a distance of 3 feet from her left side and said, in the low voice he reserved for things he did not intend the room to hear, "Stand where you are." She stood where she was. Behind her she heard Geoffrey's voice lift with a sudden new register, not authority, not confidence, something with a crack running through it like ice in February when the temperature shifts in the night. She heard Harwick say something she could not catch. She heard Fell's voice, precise and unimpressed, say, "The document was filed in this county in October of 1810. The deed your client presented in the petition is a copy of that document, with alterations. The original is in my possession and has been since March. I am prepared to place it before the magistrate on Monday alongside the petition, if Mr. Ashby wishes to proceed." The room had gone quieter in the way that rooms go quiet, when enough people hear enough of a thing to stop their own conversations. Geoffrey said, "This is a private matter." Edmund turned from Marin's side. He turned fully so that the room could see his face and his posture, which were both composed and both absolutely legible to anyone who had been watching him for the past 2 months. And he said, in a voice that required no amplification, "Geoffrey Ashby, the document your solicitor presented in the petition for guardianship was fabricated. The original deed contains no provision for incapacity claims. Mr. Fell has the original." Harwick made a sound, Cordelia said from across the room, in a voice that was still trying to hold its shape. "The widow cannot even follow what is being said. She is deaf. She has been deaf for years." Edmund looked at Marin. She looked back at him. She held his gaze for the first time in 6 years of public meetings, directly and without the vacancy she had worn like a second gown. He said, "She hears everything, Ashby. That is why you feared her." The room did not gasp. It did something quieter, which was the collective reordering of 6 years of received understanding, the silent arithmetic of 40 people who had known the deaf widow of Crane Street, and were now revising that acquaintance from its first occasion. It was not loud. It was a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the assembly rooms, the kind of thing you feel in your chest before you can name it. Geoffrey looked at Marin. She met his eyes, and she did not speak, and she did not look away. He looked at Harwick. Harwick looked at the floor. Fell stepped forward with a document folder under his arm and said, very calmly, to no one in particular, "The petition is withdrawn. I have Mr. Ashby's signature on the withdrawal to that effect obtained before we arrived this evening." He paused. Mr. Ashby found the original deed persuasive. Cordelia sat down in the nearest chair, her posture fragmented into something smaller than she had been when she entered the room. Geoffrey said nothing further. He had the look of a man who had built a particular architecture with great care over many years, and had arrived at the moment when the ground had gone soft and the building was still standing, but everyone present could see the angle at which it was leaning. He picked up his hat from the side table where he had placed it when he came in, and he walked out of the assembly rooms without speaking to anyone, and the doors closed behind him. The musicians in the corner, who had been holding their instruments in their laps for the past 4 minutes, began to play. It was the only thing anyone could think to do. Reverend Howell, who had been near the south wall, and who was a man of procedural conscience, crossed the room and said to Fell, "Is there anything that requires a formal witness? I am prepared to provide one." Fell said that he had what he needed and thanked the Reverend, and Howell withdrew. The room was not silent. It had returned to the ordinary sounds of 40 people in a candlelit space, the clatter of glasses and the murmur of voices and the musicians finding their footing in a tune. The sounds were familiar. The room was not the same room it had been 20 minutes ago. Marin was aware of this the way she was aware of a change in barometric pressure, a shift too large to name in any single detail, only felt in the aggregate. She was also aware that several people near the south wall were watching her, not with the dismissive accommodation they had offered the deaf widow for 6 years, but with the particular attention of people who are revising a long-held understanding and have not yet finished the arithmetic. A woman in a yellow dress, whom Marin recognized as the wife of a Thornport magistrate, was looking at her with an expression that was part confusion and part something that might eventually become respect, if it had time to arrive. An older gentleman near the window, who had known Gerald, was looking at his own glass with the focused attention of someone reviewing a series of past conversations. Agnes appeared at Marin's left side. She said nothing. She stood close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, which was Agnes's version of an embrace in a public room. Marin looked at the south wall. The wallpaper was still peeling at its seam. It had been peeling in April when she stood in this same place and heard Jeffrey say the petition was ready. 2 months had passed. The seam had not been repaired. The room had continued on its ordinary business of coming apart at its edges while everything that mattered in it was being decided. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth his coat had retained from the fire near the north wall. He said, very low, "I received your message the evening Agnes delivered it. I needed 5 days to reach Fell in London and another 10 to return. I apologize for the silence." She looked at the musicians. The viola player had solved the tuning difficulty, and the instrument was holding its note cleanly now. She said aloud, "For the first time in a public room since November of 1808, you were in time." He was very still beside her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." The season had frayed entirely by the time they married, which was in September. In the church at Thornport, where Edmund had sat in the same pew every Sunday since he had returned to the county in April and made himself stay. The church smelled of old stone and late summer grass, and Agnes was in the 3rd row with Nora and Thomas had his fist pressed against his cheek the way he always did when he was trying not to be visibly happy. Marin had moved her household to Dorset House in August. On the first evening in the East Wing, Edmund had shown her the upper hall and the space on the wall where a portrait had hung before it was turned and then removed. He said that the painter was coming the following week, and he had not yet decided what to put there instead. She said that she would think about it. He said, "Take your time." She said, "I am no longer in a hurry." She meant it. 6 years of strategic patience had used up her supply of hurry, and she found she did not miss it. The music box lived on Nora's windowsill now. The window looked out over the garden at Dorset House, which was a better garden than the one in Crane Street, and Nora wound the box each night before she slept, and the 4 bars of the lullaby moved through the rooms of the East Wing, the way all small repeated sounds come to feel like permanence. On the morning after the wedding, which was a clear September morning, with dew still on the lawn and the light coming in at a low angle that turned everything it touched briefly gold. Thomas came into the room where Marin was drinking her coffee and stood in the doorway with the music box in his hand. He said, "Nora wants to know if she can put it in the window where the birds can hear it." Marin said yes. He turned back to carry the answer. She heard his feet on the floorboards, and then heard him reach the windowsill, and heard Nora say something indistinct and satisfied, and then heard the 4 bars of the lullaby begin, thin and bright in the morning air. She sat with her coffee and listened. She had always been listening. That was the only thing it had ever taken. Thank you for staying until the end of Marin's story. If you were holding your breath in that assembly room, you were not alone.